Welcome to the second mini lecture for this week about paths of development in the MENA region. So I'm only going to talk about two state models of development. There are other approaches that countries have taken, but the two that were mentioned in this week's reading happen to be ISI, or import substitution industrialization and structural adjustment programs. So those are the two that I want to give you more context about. So when we're thinking about these policies, we want to take a little step back and think about trade in general. So most economists will all agree now today that trade is generally beneficial, right? We should have free trade. Comparative advantage exists where you want to export what you are comparatively good at and import the rest. But there's different perspectives to thinking about the role of trade in development and in the strategies and policies that countries adopt to improve their development. So I'm just going to talk about mercantilism and economic liberalism, since those are the two primary ones. Marxism or structuralism, or things like dependency theory, world systems theory, if you've heard about those before, I'm not going to focus on them in this particular lecture, but they do exist as also policies that countries have tried to adopt. So mercantilism basically says states are the primary actors. If you have taken POL 140, the international relations course here, or if you've taken it elsewhere, you've probably learned about realism as kind of a grand theory of international relations, of the ways that countries interact with each other. And realism really says that states are the main actors, and there's no such thing as being able to cooperate for mutual benefit. Somebody, even if you trade with somebody, someone's always going to be the winner, someone's always going to be the loser. And this is a similar perspective to mercantilism, right? That the goal is to maximize your national interests, so get the most favorable distribution of wealth for your country, that really you need to be building your wealth because you are ultimately concerned about power. Because you operate in this international system where there's no 911 to call, and so you constantly have to be looking over your shoulder to see if your neighbor's potentially going to make maneuvers on you and try to attack you or gang up against you. And so it's a very dog world kind of perspective. And there's other aspects of mercantilism too, right, where you really want to have a positive balance of trade, that a negative balance of trade is bad. Although I will say, just as an aside, most economists would say that the balance of trade and having a trade deficit is fine. But this particular perspective thinks that you should not have that, and that you should really be kind of stockpiling all of your wealth because it helps you become a stronger country. And so on the flip side, economic liberalism has a different perspective about the role of trade, and this is going to tie back to development shortly in just a few slides. So here, the main actors are not states, but they're households, they're companies. This perspective, if you again have taken POL 140 or know anything about international relations, this perspective is most closely related to liberalism as an international relations theory, not liberalism in the political ideology sense, or the way that we think about liberals and conservatives in American politics, but liberalism has a very specific definition in IR. And in a nutshell, it basically expects that states can cooperate. They don't always cooperate, but that they can cooperate, and that cooperation can be mutually beneficial, right? And that the goal of economic policy is to optimize efficiency, to build wealth, and that interdependence, rather than making you vulnerable, will actually promote peace. And there is something called the capitalist peace, which says that countries that trade with each other don't go to war with each other. So trade works by removing a lot of heavy intervention from the government, that there's this invisible hand of the market that's supposed to do its magic, right? And that you're not supposed to, when it comes to international trade, you're not supposed to adopt a lot of protectionist measures like tariffs, subsidies, etc., that you really want to promote free trade across the world, right? And so mercantilism was the main approach in the 18th century. And really, when it comes to thinking about the role of trade and policies, economic liberalism has been predominant because most economists argue, and the evidence supports the fact that generally free trade is good. And this is connected to the policies that states have adopted because these two kind of like meta perspectives inform the way that countries adjust, promote, implement their strategies to help them develop. So, what developing countries did, and obviously countries in the Middle East fall in this category, and developing, what we're really talking about here are countries that do not fall in like the high income category, those that are not rich, right? Those that are trying to boost their economies, to grow them, to improve like the human development of their people as well. So what did countries do? Well, there's kind of four approaches that have been taken. We're only going to talk about ISI and structural adjustment programs. We're not going to talk about EOG, but if you know the China model, where you basically promote the development of certain industries so that they focus on exports, you make foreign countries want to build factories in your country so that you can export cheaper goods to the world. That is what export oriented industrialization or export oriented growth is. That is not something the Middle Eastern countries did. Middle Eastern countries, when they first became independent, followed this ISI, which was actually really, really popular at the time that many of them became independent. It originated really in like Latin American countries, and it really originated with this idea of trying to encourage countries to become independent and sort of like shut off all influence of colonial powers. Was not particularly successful, which I'll get to in a moment. But the neoliberal or Washington Consensus or structural adjustment programs, this is based on a real neoliberal perspective where you want to like remove the heavy-handed intervention of the state in the market. And this is not to say that even in like neoliberalism, even in like free trade, it's there's still definitely a role for the government. I mean, the government has to exist because you need to have a currency. You need to have things like rule of law. You need to protect private property rights, right? You need to make sure that if you decide to form a business, that somebody is not going to come raid your business and close it down and steal all of your goods, right? So even when we talk about like free trade and capitalism, there's still definitely a big role for the government to play in making sure that there is a business environment that is stable and conducive to trading. But the extent to which the government intervenes in those businesses and the economy varies. Like this perspective, it's much more government intervening in the economy to promote development, whereas this perspective, it's more like the government is providing like building a foundation of stability, but then taking a step back and letting the private sector guide the actual development. And this micro lending or microeconomic approaches, this is really on like a more nonprofit level. So I don't mention it necessarily in this lecture, but if you're interested, if you've ever heard about these like micro lending programs, like I think like Kava is one of them, and then there are others that basically you have the opportunity to donate money or to make like a small loan to an actual individual person who wants to form their own small business at a really good rate. And then that person is able to pay that back, and it helps build the economy from a very like bottom up perspective. So like these three very much involve the state. Here the state is supposed to be staying out of the economy but providing really like positive fundamentals for businesses to grow. These two perspectives, the state is very much intervening strongly in the economy, and this microeconomic one, it's just more on like a person to person basis. Okay, so ISI in a nutshell. Basically, what this development policy is is all about is it's trying to develop local economies by producing items that a country before had been importing. So you initially try to build up those local businesses for local consumption, but eventually the goal is to get so competitive that you can then export them and grow your economy that way. So this was adopted by a lot of countries in the MENA, as well as Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa. And what ISI did is to increase local demand for these products. You had a lot of trade restrictions. So tariffs, non-tariff barriers, and then so you reduced the number of imports coming into your country, but obviously people still need those things that you were importing before. So then you try to spur like local businesses to be able to develop, to produce those goods. And that's done with a lot of involvement from the state, right? So some examples would be like in Brazil and Mexico. Those countries try to build up their automotive industries by limiting imports of cars from, say, like the United States, to try to get like local companies to produce those vehicles domestically, but then with the goal of trying to export them. The problem, though, is that this initially helped countries develop, but eventually, because you had a lot of people that were invested in making sure that the government stayed involved in supporting these businesses rather. So the businesses didn't end up becoming competitive internationally, and it really led to stalled development. So led to corruption, issues with international debt, as was mentioned in the textbook. And it really, while there was a period of time where countries, especially those that just first emerged as independent states, used it to develop because it was popular at that time, it turned out to not be a good policy of development because it required too much government intervention, and it ended up leading to a lot of corruption and a lot of inefficiency. And so the idea of limiting your imports so that you could grow your local industries so that they could then become eventually competitive and export, that never happened. And so instead, what replaced a lot of development strategies in countries that were trying to build their economies was this like neoliberal Washington consensus. And it's called the Washington consensus because these international organizations, financial ones like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, that really are led by the United States, they promoted these policies, hence the Washington consensus. So this involved the state in the economy, but in such a way that the state was just supposed to adopt good monetary and fiscal policies and take a step back. So there was no providing of subsidies to certain companies to help them grow. You were just basically supposed to create this like favorable petri dish for these companies, and the best ones would compete against each other, and therefore you would have development. And so these are its main policies, right? You could see that the state is involved, but it's really involved in making sure that you liberalize trade, you reduce all these barriers, you privatize any state-run industries, you do things like avoiding big deficits and high inflation, and you're really open to investment from foreign countries as opposed to limiting imports and foreign involvement. And the idea was you were supposed to have short-term cost, and this was going to be costly because people had been depending on a lot of these like state-run businesses for jobs and on a lot of subsidies and a lot of like state intervention. So it was going to hurt initially, but better off in the long run. And so was it better off in the long run? I mean, maybe, but probably not so much depending on the country. So there were a lot of short-term losses. People lost those subsidies. A lot of people that had been employed by, probably inefficient state-run industries, but employed nonetheless, lost their jobs. In some countries, this was successful, but not in others. And it was not successful in some countries because a couple things. Some countries did not take steps to limit the impact of adopting these structural adjustment programs. Some countries adopted them partially, but not fully. So you got all of like the negative externalities of making cuts to subsidies, but not doing enough to start to see some of the benefits. And so what ended up happening is that there was an adjustment made in these programs saying like, okay, well, maybe we can't have this, cookie cutter approach. All countries have to do, these four things. We still want to limit the involvement of the state in the economy and let the private market do its quote unquote magic. But we want to make these programs have like a bigger social safety net and importantly, focus on good governance. Like you can enact as many of these like structural adjustment policies as you want, but if you are not at the same time doing things that promote good governance, that make sure that leaders who are stewards of the economy are keeping the public's interest in mind as opposed to like their own or the small members of their inner circle because you're in an autocracy, right? Like that's going to be problematic. So this is a good segue to this final part of this lecture about how do you explain differences in development? And these are explanations that don't just apply to the Middle East or North African countries. These are explanations that are just kind of broad ones in the development studies literature in general. So a big problem with development, irrespective if you are using ISI or structural adjustment programs, is when you have corruption. So when you have the people who are in charge having no checks and balances on their behaviors, when you have this like, not only at the top do you get corruption, but it kind of filters down throughout all levels of the economy because people are so poorly underpaid that, you as a public service worker are so poorly underpaid, and you see your friends doing this, getting bribes for different services that you provide. It just creates this culture of corruption that really undermines any development strategy that you try to adopt. And if you're interested, you could look at Transparency International's. This is a nonprofit organization that does research about corruption. They have a corruption index, and there's an explanation at this link for how they calculate it. But you can look to see which countries are the least corrupt in the world and those that are the most corrupt. All right, so two of the main explanations. There are others, like having a civil war or being involved in an interstate war or being a neighbor to a country that has a civil war. Like those are all also major causes of underdevelopment. But the two that the authors of this week's chapter really focus on have to do with the natural resource curse and also good governance. So the natural resource curse is basically as follows. Normally, we think that natural resources could be good for development, right? We would think intuitively if you have things to sell and export like oil or natural gas, right, then you have something that you can then get money back for and invest back into your country and your people and your infrastructure and all kinds of things. But this is really conditional on the type of political regime that you have. If you have if you're a democracy and you find natural resources, generally you will use them to develop. So think like countries like Norway, for example. Norway has a lot of natural resources, but yet it is a democracy, and those checks and balances allow Norway and its leaders to ensure that any of the economic gains that come from selling those natural resources are invested back into the country, right? Because if you are not doing that, and if you're a leader in a democracy, you are going to get voted out of office. And most people who run for office want to stay in office. So that's like a built-in incentive in the system to ensure that there's checks and balances and that there's less corruption. Unfortunately, if you are an autocracy, there are no such checks and balances that exist. And so natural resources plus autocracy tends to be quite bad for development. That's why you have countries like, for example, the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo in sub-Saharan Africa, that has huge amounts of natural resources, but it is incredibly poor and very, very corrupt. And there have also been a lot of conflicts fought over those resources. So when you don't have those checks and balances to ensure that all of like the positive gains that come from those resources are distributed equally, you will have corruption. You will probably have conflict. You will have underdevelopment. And the thing that's interesting about Middle Eastern countries is that actually all of them, save Israel, are considered to be autocratic. So yes, it's true, democracies tend to do better than non-democracies that have natural resources, but all of the Middle Eastern countries are not democracies, and yet they vary in their development. So what the authors of this chapter that we're reading this week did is they introduced this idea of the high oil, middle oil countries. And the basic gist here is that, like, depending on your resources and the number of people who live in your country, that's going to influence if you do end up having the ability to develop better or not. So having natural resources plus a low population means that you can distribute those resources back to people so that you can stay in charge. So you're basically like paying off the population so that they don't rise up against you. And you can also promote private investment. But when you have natural resources in a non-democracy plus a big population, there tends to be too many people and not enough natural resources that you can adequately pay everybody off. So you focus on instead paying off the people who might be the greatest threat to you, or building up like a pretty extensive surveillance state. And so then you don't put that money back into your economy just because you have too many people to distribute it to. And so I think this is a really interesting explanation for how in a region that's characterized by a lot of autocracies, you could still explain variation in development outcomes depending on this combination of natural resources plus low or high population. And then finally, good governance. I mean, this is pretty intuitive, right? You would think that if you have checks and balances, on average, those countries are going to develop better, have better economies, better outcomes for people than countries that don't have any checks and balances, where leaders are not beholden to and or interested in making sure that the majority of people vote for them. So the Varieties of Democracy, or VDEM, and we've looked at their data before. They also have this really fantastic set of policy briefs where they wanted to look at research about outcomes of democracies versus autocracies, right? People usually look at China and say, but look, China's an autocracy and it's grown, and so that must mean that autocracies can also develop. And it's true that China has grown its economy a lot, and a lot of people have moved from being poor to middle income in China. But actually, a lot of the gains that were seen in China came from a period not where there was political liberalization, but where there was a lot of economic liberalization. And currently, China under Xi Jinping has really, there's never been any political liberalization, but it's also really decreased the economic liberalization of the country and re-intervened into the market considerably. And so we're actually seeing decreases in China's economy right now. So China is not really an exception to the rule. It actually proves the rule that if you open your economy up and you liberalize, it can be beneficial. But at the same time, right, in general, having checks and balances is good for development. And on average, you have checks and balances in democracies. And so there's links here to all these different policy briefs that VDEM has published. I know these are all listed as questions, right? Can democracy limit corruption? The answers to all of these are yes, right? Democracies outperform autocracies on all of these different outcomes because there are checks and balances. And even in the case of China, right? Like, although there was no political liberalization and there were obviously no checks and balances from the general public, there used to be checks and balances within different branches of, or different like factions within the Chinese Communist Party that have since been decreased because Xi Jinping has started to amass more power. So in that context, even though we're talking about different checks and balances, we see a similar type of effect. So if you want to, you can click on any one of these to get more information. And that's going to be it for this lecture.